Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this first webinar on the Housing Element Update. We're very excited to launch the public outreach portion of the project at this time. I wanted to note for everybody that we are conducting 3 identical webinars this week. So if you do have friends and neighbors who missed out on this session, please note that there is another one tonight at 7:30 p.m. and another one on Saturday morning at 10:30 a.m. And if they're unable to make those times, not a problem. All of the webinars will be recorded and posted on the project website as well. So there will be an opportunity if you'd like to review anything after the webinar. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce the project team and some of the voices you'll be hearing on the webinar today. My name is Jing Yo. I'm in the City Planning Division. And maybe each of the team members could just unmute themselves and just say hello for a moment.
Hi, I'm Rachel Kwok. I'm environmental planner in the City Planning Division.
Hi, I'm Go ahead, Ross.
Hi, I'm Ross Furman. I'm an associate planner with the City Planning Division.
Steve Mizukami, senior planner from City Planning Division.
And I'm Kerry Fukui, an associate planner with City Planning Division.
Great. And then you don't see on the screen Heidi, who's actually the attorney on our team, but she's actually running tech support today, so not giving out legal advice. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here to start the presentation. Okay. So there we're at. So before we begin, I just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping issues. So one thing is you're probably seeing on your screen right now, I want to go over how to use some of the functions you're seeing on your screen. So here you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a series of icons, and just zoom in here, you can see the top button looks like a phone that's hanging up. That's how you have to, if you click on that, you will be leaving the event. You can view and search participants. And then there's a button for the moderator chat. Please note that that chat should only be used if you're having any technical issues. It is not used for asking questions or comments. If you do have questions or comments, please use that Q&A button. That's the button you're going to click to ask questions. And when you click on that button, you're going to see a little bar that pops up on the right like this. And that's how you're going to be asking questions during the webinar today. So you can type your question there. We do want to note that it's not going to publish or be viewed by someone. Ross is actually compiling the questions, and in the moderated Q&A at the end, he'll be kind of going over, themes that we're seeing. But don't be worried about not having your question answered. Every question will be posted verbatim on the project website, and we will have written answers to each and every question on the website that will be available after the webinar. Again, just to review the project team. So it is this project is being led by City Planning with support from the City Attorney, the Housing Division, and the Rent Control Board. The email address, if you like to contact the team at any time, is housingupdate@smgov.net. Again, housingupdate@smgov.net, and there is the project website that has a lot of information in terms of any data, facts and figures, that sort of thing. And it's the best place to go in terms of keeping up to date as to what's happening with the project and any upcoming events. So let me just go over the purpose of what we're doing today. So this is the agenda of how everything's going to go. So first of all, we want to provide an overview of what the housing element is and why we're doing this update. Throughout this whole project, you're going to be hearing some funny acronyms like SCAG, RENA, LOOSE, and other things that you may not have heard of before. We are wanting to demystify those terms and help you understand what they mean to this update. We're providing some facts and figures on the state of housing in Santa Monica and provide the local context for the update. We'll have a look back on the 2013 to 2021 housing element goals, since this is an update after all. And it also gives us an opportunity to assess whether those goals still stand. We're going to review some of the prior actions regarding housing that have already been taken, just to give you a little bit of background as to what's happened already. And then finally, we're going to wrap today with an overview of the next 11 months, ending with our deadline of October 2021, when the City Council must adopt the housing element, and then most importantly, to give you a chance to understand what we need from you in order to shape this update. And as I indicated, at the end of this, we will have time left for the Q&A. Just wanted to note that we have about an hour, so we will be ending at 1 o'clock today, just so you understand that the timing of today's webinar. So I'm going to start with what is the housing element update. So the housing element, it's a mandatory state requirement. It's a requirement that was established in 1969, and the State Department of Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD, that's another acronym you're going to hear a lot, and it mandates that each jurisdiction plans for their community's housing needs every 8 years. So for this update, we are looking at the planning period of 2021 to 2029. The prior cycle was 2013 to 2021. Santa Monica is within a planning region known as the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, S-C-A-G, and that represents 6 counties and 191 cities. So there are actually, in addition, not just us, there's 191 cities within SCAG that are going through this housing element update process right now. And SCAG takes the allocation that HCD gives, and it allocates those housing needs to all the cities within the region, and that's what we're working on right now. It's important to note also that the state can impose penalties if the city fails to plan for those housing needs. So the housing element is one of the mandatory components of the general plan. The general plan, think of it like the Constitution for the city. So there are 7 mandatory elements within the general plan. The housing element obviously is one. There's the land use and circulation element. Oh, there's a little spelling error there, otherwise known as the LUCE, L-U-C-E. So land use and circulation element is what that stands for. Conservation element is another mandatory element. There's a safety element, an open space element, and a noise element. We also, the city also has a historic preservation element, which is not one of the listed state mandated elements, but it's one that the city chose to do. There are other housing plans in addition to the housing element. There's a consolidated plan, and it was just approved recently in August. What that plan does is that it details how federal funding will be spent on priority needs that are determined through a public process, and you can see a listing there of what those priorities are in this current consolidated plan. There's also an assessment of fair housing that was also approved earlier this year, and that's required in order to identify fair housing issues and barriers that prevent access to fair housing. So why are we doing this update? As I touched on, it's a requirement that the city plans for the housing needs of the community. And the housing element consists of 5 major components. There are goals, policies, and actions. And what that is it sort of sets out the program of how those housing needs will be met. The housing element also includes within it a needs assessment and characteristics, both demographic and of the housing stock, to provide sort of baseline data as to what those needs are. We're required to identify barriers to market rate and affordable housing development. We are required to evaluate the progress from the prior 8 years, from that 2013 to 2021 planning period, and also identify sites that can accommodate those needs. So this update is taking place against the backdrop of a declared statewide housing crisis. And as we all know, it is very expensive to live in California. We're in a decades of increasing housing costs. California's statewide median home cost is about 2 times the national median. There's about an estimated shortage of 3 million units in the state due to the imbalance between supply and demand. There's a much greater demand for housing, than there is available, and even more pronounced is that there's a greater demand for affordable homes. It's an estimated 1.3 million low-income renter households need affordable homes that don't exist. And there's tremendous inequity in terms of cost burden across various income bands. Households at the lower income at the lower incomes are disproportionately affected, and it's about 8 in 10 low-income households spend upwards of 50% of their income on housing costs. And you can see there the graphic on the right. It sort of demonstrates sort of some responses here as to how people are feeling about their ability to afford housing costs within California, and that Southern California region, which you can see that big green blob on the bottom. You're looking at about 3/4 of people feeling that they're being priced out, whether it's in terms of rental or ownership for housing costs. So I will now turn over the next section to Rachel, who is going to talk about Santa Monica's context for this update, and also give you an overview of some facts and figures. So Rachel, go ahead.
Thanks, Jing. So Jing talked a little bit about the statewide housing crisis. And so what is the situation right now in terms of housing for Santa Monica? Because it's important as we're considering the housing element update. Well, what are the facts and the figures that we're looking at? Next slide, Jing. So when we plan for housing, we need to first take into account the population. This is important because we need to know how many people live in the city and what the demographic of the city looks like, so we can appropriately plan for the housing needs. As you can see in this chart, in 1970, the population has remained relatively stable, dropped a bit down to a little bit down in 2000. But then has increased in the last 20 years by about 5.2%. In 2018, the population remained relatively stable, and there's been shown that in the last year or two that this population has actually dropped just a slight bit, due in part to a number of factors, including just people having smaller families, and the high cost of housing is really just forcing people out of California. So we do see that right now we're around 92,000 people residents in the city. Now, in terms of the age groups and the age distribution of the city, we're seeing a lot more 25 to 44-year-olds. This is what we're calling the middle-aged population, and this is the population that they're the ones that are getting into the career sector, going into the first couple jobs, and they're looking really to expand their families and grow their families. And so, as you can see here, this is a large share of our population that really needs new housing. In terms of a housing inventory, we have about 52,000 housing units in the city. The vast majority of them, about 77%, are multifamily. When we say multifamily, we mean things like apartment complexes and some duplexes. As you can see here, there's only really about 11,000 single-family homes, and these are mostly concentrated in the North of Montana neighborhood and the Wilshire, Montana neighborhood. The rest of the city are primarily multifamily units within 2 to 5 or even more unit buildings. So over the past 20 years, single-family units have remained relatively stable. We haven't seen much growth, of course. Our residential neighborhoods are fairly built out, and so as you can see, the numbers have remained somewhat steady. What we've been seeing in terms of residential growth is that this has been occurring for multifamily housing units only, and this has increased by about 12%. We're seeing a lot more of this multifamily housing occurring within areas such as the downtown and along boulevards where there's generally mixed-use commercial on the bottom and the ground floor. And as you can see, in terms of looking at home ownership, as compared to most cities and even a nation, we have a very low percentage of home ownership. About 28.6% of the population here owns their home, while vast majority of our residents are renting their house or a housing unit. To break down our housing supply, as I mentioned before, 28.6% of those are owner occupied. The rest, the 71%, are renter occupied. This includes about 22,000 rent controlled units in the city. And then we also have about 4,500 affordable housing units in the city. That 4,500 doesn't include any rent-controlled apartments that perhaps were occupied prior to 1999. So that's a conservative estimate. But the remaining 16,000 are non-rent controlled, and they generally consist of newer multifamily apartment buildings that were built after the rent control. And then also our housing supply tends to be relatively old. The vast majority of our housing supply was built after 1980. More than 75% of this was built before 1980, and so very few of them are newer units. And so we'll hear a lot of anecdotal evidence from renters saying that the building they moved into have outdated appliances and so forth. And this is because the vast majority of our units are fairly old. And not only are they old, they are expensive. And so Santa Monica is one of the priciest places to live in the nation. We have a median price of $3.9 million for a single family home. This is much more than the national, which is around $260,000 for a single family home. And condos are not any better. The median home price for a condo is about $900,000, trending upwards towards $1 million. And so condos and single family homes are very expensive to buy here in the city. And renting doesn't offer much more relief, because we're seeing at about a median rent of about $3,200 for a 2-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica. Compared that to the national average, which is about slightly over $1,000 per month for a 2-bedroom apartment. Next slide. So we have a housing situation. We're in the midst of a housing crisis. How are we going to plan for our future housing needs? And how do we determine what our future housing needs are? Next slide. Well, we have this thing called the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which stands for RHNA. This is determined by the state, and it's really it represents the number of units that are needed in the state for an 8-year cycle. This RHNA number is at the statewide level is then further divided amongst the regions of the state. As Jing mentioned before, we're located in the Southern California region, the SCAG region. SCAG, who's the Metropolitan Planning Organization, has taken this RHNA number and divided it amongst the cities. And these cities must demonstrate that the RHNA allocation can be accommodated over the next 8-year cycle. When we say accommodated, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to build it, but we must show in our housing element that we have the plans and policies and the programs in place to accommodate this many units. Slide. So how is our RHNA determined? We were given this 8,873 number. So how was that determined? Well, the numbers first. There's a methodology that has been revised since the last housing element cycle. This methodology first takes into account the jurisdiction's projected housing need. That is based on things like past household growth in the city, what its future vacancy need is, and what its replacement housing need is. Then once they figure that projected housing need out, they apply factors, apply factors such as what is the city's transit accessibility? Does the city have accessible transit services nearby? How many jobs are in the city? And things like that. So they apply those factors to get to the jurisdiction's total housing need. Then once they get to that, they have to make adjustments to account for social equity. And this is to ensure that we are accounting for a disproportionate geographic concentration of each income category, and that we're also meeting the goals of AB 1771, which is a state law that was passed in 2018, that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing, that we are providing equal opportunity to build housing across the city. And so that's how we get to the final RHNA number. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, the RHNA number is developed at the state level, then it's kind of divided amongst a region. And within the region, so Southern California was given this number of 1.3 million units. And SCAG has divided that amongst the cities and jurisdictions and given us this total number of 8,873 units, of which 70% of it approximately must be affordable. So as I mentioned, 8,873 is our RHNA allocation for 2021 through 2029, this next 8-year housing element cycle. 70% of it must be at low income. So if we're talking about 8,873 units in the next 8 years, we're averaging about 1,100 units per year. We would need to permit that much in order to meet our RHNA numbers. And so the breakdown, as I mentioned before, for the affordable housing, it's 70% that must be at lower incomes, and this is the breakdown that's shown on this table. As you can see, it's going to be quite a challenge to provide to ensure that we will be providing this affordable housing inventory here. Next. So how do we achieve our RHNA? One of the first steps, and Jing mentioned this briefly, is as part of the housing element, we will be needing to identify eligible housing sites through what we're calling, or what the state calls, the Suitable Sites Inventory, the SSI. And what is the Suitable Sites Inventory? It's basically an inventory identification of all the properties that have the potential to develop residential units. The purpose of it is to show that Santa Monica, as a city, we have adequate land, we have sufficient sites to accommodate our RHNA number by income category. Next slide. So the methodology for preparing the SSI, first what we're going to be doing, and what we've already actually started doing, is gathering data with regards to the city land use inventory. This is basically inventory of all the existing parcels in the city and what they were developed with, and then we apply filters considering factors such as existing constraints, environmental constraints, as well as site characteristics. For example, whether or not the parcel has a historic landmark on it, or if the site has a hazardous element, either contamination on it. So once we apply these filters, we get to our potential suitable properties. When we have these lists of properties, we apply what we're calling the realistic capacity, which is applying the development standards to these properties, and then knowing what we know can realistically develop on those sites, we figure out the potential housing, the housing potential of all those sites. And from there, we look at, well, if we look at our sites, we have, the potential to develop 6,000 units. If that's not meeting our RHNA, then we have to apply policy and zoning changes as needed so that we can meet our final RHNA number. And that's how we get to the final suitable sites inventory. Next slide. A couple of things to consider as we're going through the SSI is we are taking a look at development trends. For example, if we're looking at a parcel, we're looking at other similar parcels in the city and whether or not they have been redeveloping, considering similar site characteristics. We're also looking at market conditions and evaluating the market conditions on redevelopment and seeing whether or not there is a likelihood of a housing project being developed there instead of a commercial project. And another thing that we are considering is whether or not that parcel, our housing project on that parcel would have financial assistance, any streamlining, processing, concessions, or flexible development standards that will enable housing development on that site. Other things to consider, we're not just looking at just, things like site characteristics. We're also looking at things like whether or not the site has access to the much needed residential amenities that we all love to have, things like access to jobs, proximity to transit, whether or not it has access to schools and healthcare. We're also looking at, as I mentioned before, whether or not there are development incentives available for that particular parcel given its location. And then one of the things, as I mentioned before too, was the requirement, the state law requirement that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing, that we're not just putting, all of the affordable housing in one area of the city, and that we are actually taking meaningful action to foster inclusive communities, and we are addressing significant disparities in housing needs. As an overarching guideline or guidance that we are looking at is of course, the loose growth strategy. As we're going through the SSI, we don't anticipate that we will be different, that we will differ from or vary from the growth strategy that was identified in the loose. As I mentioned before, we are looking at ensuring that housing units have proximity to transit. So this is similar to what the loose growth strategy which was fostering transit-oriented mixed-use communities. The loose also called for a commitment to affordable housing. With the housing element, we are looking to accommodate for 70% of our 8,800 units will be low income. And so by developing and ensuring that housing is located near transit, we can maintain the character of the residential neighborhoods. These are the principles that guided the 2013 and 2021 SSI, and we anticipate that it will be the same guiding factors for the upcoming SSI. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Mizukami, who's going to go over our previous housing element and the various goals that we had identified before.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Steve Mizukami here, and I'll be going over this next section 4, which is a brief overview of the current housing element goals and objectives. So as we move forward with thinking about this next housing cycle, we want to make sure that we reflect on the goals and objectives of the current housing element, and also see which goals should be maintained or revised as appropriate, while also thinking whether there are new goals and objectives to include in the next housing plan. So one exercise of this webinar is to begin thinking about the current housing element goals. And after this session, we encourage you all to take an online questionnaire and provide us with your thoughts on these goals, or suggest other goals and areas that we should be considered. And this questionnaire will be available for a while, so don't feel that you need to learn the goals at this very moment. There will be links on our website to the current goals so that you can take your time in reviewing them as they are provided in the current housing element. So this next section 4 is a brief summary of the current housing element goals as a quick introduction. Next slide. So goal number 1 is about making sure that the construction of our housing is of high quality, is sustainable, and is compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. Objectives to meeting the goals. These goals include, for example, updating the zoning ordinance based on the land use and circulation plan, which establishes zoning and development standards for a variety of different housing types and affordability levels. As we know, the zoning ordinance was adopted back in 2015. Another is maintaining an architectural review process to ensure the quality of our buildings, and also to continue to encourage green building to facilitate sustainable housing. And also facilitating housing development in mixed-use transit-oriented areas of the city, such as the downtown and the Bergamot areas. And of course, these specific plans were also adopted in most recent years. Moving on to goal number 2, which involves housing production for all income levels, including workforce housing. An objective is to maintain the city's affordable housing production program, also known as the AHPP, by implementing, evaluating, and also revising the program to address the housing needs of the city. Goal number 3 is to protect the existing supply of affordable housing. An objective is to continue to implement programs that protect tenants against discrimination, facilitate the conservation of at-risk housing, and to maintain a tenant eviction protection program to prevent unlawful evictions. Next slide. Goal number 4 is to make sure that we have continued maintenance and rehabilitation of our existing housing stock. This includes maintaining a residential repair program, which seeks to fund the rehabilitation of apartments and home repairs occupied by low-income residents, and maintaining the current earthquake retrofit program, which requires seismic retrofitting of our older apartments and residences. For example, buildings with tuck-under parking that are being structurally improved that you may be seeing out there throughout the city of Santa Monica, as well as the Los Angeles region. Goal number 5 is about housing assistance for affordable and above moderate income level households, as well as households with special needs. This would include maintaining rental housing voucher programs and assisting all persons with disabilities, and continued support of the tenant relocation program, including temporary relocation due to any remodeling or safety upgrades within a tenant's residential unit. And also to facilitate the reduction of homeless persons through a range of housing options with emphasis on affordable housing, supportive housing, and eventually permanent housing. Next slide. So goal 6 would include maintaining fair housing programs, which means educating landlords on practices that meet fair housing laws. And goal number 7, which seeks active participation of our residents and community groups on housing and neighborhood safety. This might include continuing to offer neighborhood safety programs in cooperation and coordination with the Santa Monica Police Department. So again, these are just a few of the objectives for each of the 7 goals in the current housing element that we will be reflecting on as we look to formalize the appropriate goals for this next housing cycle. Again, these goals and objectives can be found on the current housing element that is provided on the city's website. This concludes this section. Next, Jing will be discussing section 5 on Santa Monica's approach to housing, including housing priorities and also phases of implementation.
Great, thank you, Steve. So we've heard a lot at this point about the state of housing in Santa Monica, how those needs are calculated in a review of the prior goals. This section is all about Santa Monica's housing priorities and actions that have been taken thus far recently to address these priorities and sort of set the groundwork for the work to come. So Santa Monica's housing priorities kind of center around 2 areas of production and preservation. In terms of preservation, the city looks to stabilize the existing housing stock. So Santa Monica has had rent control for several decades now. So there's about 50,000 rent control, or excuse me, 50,000 rental units in the city, and about a little over 28,000, I believe, of rent controlled units in the city. And in addition to that, state law requires that now that there's a no net loss in terms of the units that are redeveloped or that are removed from the market. So that's a big part of the city's actions around stabilizing the existing housing stock. Santa Monica has also been a strong supporter of 100% affordable housing in terms of providing process and development incentives. And in terms of planning for the community's housing needs, that's been done consistent with the adopted growth strategy in the land use and circulation element, largely in terms of encouraging housing close to transit, so we have that strong relationship between land use and transportation systems. So this is just a review of some immediate actions that have taken place over the past year in line with mandates from the state in terms of production that I'll review in a moment. So in terms of production, there's been a strong focus at the state legislative level since 2017 when the housing crisis was declared by the governor to streamline administrative approval for all code compliant housing projects. And this was intended to remove some of those process and regulatory barriers for the production of housing. In addition to that, there have been changes in state law recently with respect to density bonus law, particularly for 100% affordable housing, streamlining, and obviously there's a strong interest also in accessory dwelling units and what that may provide in terms of housing opportunities. So there's a strong interest in removing those barriers. In terms of preservation, very recently the City Council took action to protect existing rental housing units as permanent housing stock in the city. So there's new regulations that took effect October the 9th, requiring all leases to be at least 1 year. They must be leased to natural persons intended as their primary residence, and those units must be leased unfurnished. This was in response to concerns about activity that corporate housing activity and the like that was taking some of that permanent rental housing stock off the market. This is a little diagram here about some of the changes in state law from the 2019 legislative session. And so you can see some of the highlights consistent, when a big housing package went through the legislature in 2017 in terms of streamlining approvals, a lot of focus on accessory dwelling units. And I think on the flip side also, there's been new measures including statewide rent control, to certain classes of units, increased tenant protections to sort of balance, that production side of things. So, after those actions that have been taken to, largely stabilize the existing housing stock and provide an avenue for 100% affordable housing to move quicker through the process, where we are now is working, towards having a certified housing element. So, sort of big areas. What that involves is largely data updates, and what we're doing today and launching is, in terms of public input for determining our city's housing needs. The suitable sites inventory process, that's the process in terms of identifying sites that can accommodate potential housing growth, and research and policy formulation with respect to density bonus law, accessory dwelling units, and this sort of category, kind of calling new housing models, new, but not probably all that new. It's sort of going back to maybe what a lot of models that have been going on for quite some time in terms of co-living and co-housing models, sort of innovative ways that we're seeing providers respond to this massive shortage in housing, providing potentially more flexible living arrangements, allowing people to find places to live that are inherently more affordable due to their smaller size. In addition to that, we will be looking at feasibility analyses to understand the likelihood of housing projects instead of commercial development, and how we can maximize on-site inclusionary affordable housing in any market rate housing that's developed. And we did want to note that, obviously we are operating in the COVID-19 pandemic right now, and I think what that has highlighted to everybody is the inequities that exist around housing, and this update is an opportunity to account for the effects of COVID-19, the inequities that have been highlighted, and really highlights, I think most importantly, the importance of stable housing available for all populations. And finally, under all of this is an environmental impact report that will be done as well. We did want to note that the notice of preparation, what that is that it's a sort of launch on a public notification that the EIR is starting, and the initial public input period will be available until December 31st. And Carrie will talk more about kind of the process and timeline going forward. So that brings us to this final section, where, as I mentioned, Carrie will be talking about the process and timeline and what you can expect going forward, and help that we will need from you.
Great, thanks, Jing. So as Jing mentioned, for the final section, I'll review the general project timeline and highlight all the major project milestones and where we want to hear from you in this process. Slide. So the Housing Element Update project was launched in the late summer, early fall. Currently, we are in the initial outreach phase, marked here with the red arrow. And during this stage, we want to hear from you. So you'll have the opportunity to participate by reviewing our initial data and research, which is up on our project website. You're here participating in these webinars. You can also join a technical working group, which I will talk on more shortly. Answer our first project questionnaire, as Steve mentioned earlier, and attend a virtual study session with the Planning Commission, which we're hosting next week on November 18th, and then another study session with the Council, which will be on December 15th. Following that, our next milestone will be in March, where after hearing from you and these technical working groups, we'll start to develop concepts and options for public review. So in the spring, we'll host more webinars, publish more questionnaires for you to answer, and also host more study sessions. So this will allow you to discuss these concepts and options for the new Housing Element Update. And with that, we'll begin drafting the Housing Element Update around June, leading to the goal of transmitting the draft Housing Element to HCD in July, with final adoption expected in October. Slide. So here's a highlighted summary of milestones and engagement dates for you to look out for. Now into November and through December is our initial public outreach with the project launch and the technical working groups, as well as the study sessions mentioned earlier. Later in December and January, we'll begin development of the SSI and goals and policies for the Housing Element. This will include study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council as well. And then in March, we'll give you the opportunity to comment on the potential concepts for the plan. And in June, the draft Housing Element will be released for public review with additional events for you to comment and participate on the process. Slide, please. So we understand that this virtual outreach is very different from what our community is used to. So to allow you to be heard in this process, we created a questionnaire to hear about your ideas for the project. The questionnaire will let you discuss and comment on each of those Housing Element goals mentioned earlier by Steve, and will also let you provide feedback to help us develop the future priority issues and goals for the new Housing Element Update. It has questions like what housing issues we should consider, what groups we should be planning for, what types of housing you want to see in the city, and any other ideas that you would want us to explore in this update. Slide. So another means for you to contact us is to, you can email us at housingupdate@smgov.net. If you have any other general questions or comments that weren't discussed today, send us an email and we're happy to discuss anything with you. You can sign up to receive notifications on the project through our project website. and take this questionnaire that's available through December 11th. So this is a link for the questionnaire, but we'll also be sending this around to you all, so you'll have that later on. Slide. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, that another way for you to really get involved and roll up your sleeves on this project is to join a technical working group. So we'll be forming 2 technical working groups focused on production of housing and stability and preservation of housing. Participants in these groups should really be ready to have a technical conversation on these topics and to share any data and expertise that they have in these 2 subject areas. The groups will meet up to 4 times between now and early 2021. And if you're interested in being an active participant in either of these technical working groups, signups are available on the project website through November 25th. And slide. So we want to thank you for participating in our first virtual webinar for the housing element, and we will open the question and answer portion.
Thank you, Carrie. So with that, we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. As Jing mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do not have time to answer every question that has come in during this 1-hour session, but we'll be posting every question and answers to those questions on the Housing Element website after all the webinars have concluded. So please check back if your question wasn't covered today. So now I'm going to go over and ask the presenters some of the common themes amongst the questions we have received. So I'll start with Jing. We've received a handful of questions regarding why did Santa Monica not appeal their RHNA number? Can you maybe go over the process of the appeal?
Sure, Ross. So the way I guess first I'll start off with the appeal period was from September 11th to October the 26th. So the opportunity for the city to have appealed the draft allocation has now passed. All appeals are posted on the SCAG website, which is scag.ca.gov, or if you just Google SCAG RHNA, you'll be able to see all of the appeals that have been filed. But as to why, I think it's helpful to go through the process of the appeal. Just by statute, so by state law, there are relatively limited bases for appeal. It's essentially asking whether the methodology is consistent with state law. This was intentional, and it was based on changes that were made in 2018 in terms of making the process, the RHNA allocation process, very objective and based on data, and it was intended to lessen opportunities for local factors or political factors, what have you, to influence the allocation. So the bases of the appeal by statute are very limited to whether the methodology that SCAG undertook are consistent with the requirements under state law. The process allowed cities to appeal not just their allocation, but also other cities' allocations, which was a change from previous cycles. And, in terms of why the city didn't appeal it, I think that, we seeked direction from the city council towards the end of last year as we were seeing the allocation start to form up. And, one of the city's core values has always been to do our part and our share in meeting our community's housing needs, particularly affordable housing. This draft allocation of, roughly 8,800 units, about 70% of that is affordable housing. So it is housing for the most vulnerable within our society. And, affordable housing has, certainly been even a stronger core value of the city for many decades. So appealing that allocation wouldn't have been consistent with the approach that the city has taken over many decades to support affordable housing. That being said, the appeal is not the only process to raise concerns or objections to that allocation. there is something called a quantified objective. If you look at our current 2013 to 2021 housing element right now, you'll see two numbers within that housing element. There is the RHNA, which is the allocation, and then there's the quantified objective, which is actually a lower number. And that is something that the city could present a case to HCD when we transmit the draft, in terms of having gone through. We're right now just launching the process, but we're going to go through several iterations in developing a suitable sites inventory that is going to help us understand the realistic capacity of sites, taking into account market conditions, a lot of permit data about what the city has realistically done, and the quantified objective is an opportunity to make that case in terms of other factors to be considered, in how we plan for the community's housing needs.
Great, thank you. Rachel, you had discussed kind of our overall RHNA number, and that we don't necessarily have to build them, but we have to at least show that we can accommodate the 1,800 units. Can you go over, though, what happens, though, if we fail to show that we can comply with this?
I'm sorry, did you say if we can't comply with it?
Yes.
Okay.
What happens if we cannot meet this number?
Sure. If we don't meet this number, we could lose our eligibility for a lot of state funding. And so that's number one. And number two, and Jing can elaborate too on this, is that we might lose state control over some of our planning processes. So Jing, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that as well.
Right. So, as we touched on in the presentation, it is mandatory that we go through this housing element update process. It's required by state law. If cities fail to have a certified housing element, by the deadline, there are, potential fines and penalties that come into effect, and further changes in state law. So, I think part of this is that a lot of these are written into state statutes that we don't really have a say over at this point in time. So we're required to follow what the law says we have to do, and if you have to have a certified element, but also over the next 8 years, kind of demonstrate that capacity continues, and there are other. There are other laws that kick in if we're not able to demonstrate that those goals are being met over time. That being said, if there is broader questions or concerns about it, these are laws that are being passed at the state level, and so the city is also, on the other hand, following the law, but also looking to advocate, for some refinements, to these requirements to accommodate, what's happening real time.
Great. And Rachel, could you go over again kind of like why Santa Monica's numbers were as high as they were for our RHNA? What were the factors that contributed to that?
Sure. So our fifth cycle element number was about 1,600. This time we were allocated 8,800, and there's a few reasons. Number one, it's really indicative of the fact that their state housing crisis has reached a pinnacle point, and so they've adjusted their statewide RHNA number to reflect that, and from that we got a higher number for a number of reasons. That's one of the factors, and the second factor is that SCAG has adjusted their methodology in this last cycle to account for factors such as whether or not the jurisdiction has jobs and access to transit. In the past, we've seen cities like Palmdale and the IE cities in the Inland Empire have a larger number because they had the capacity for it, and they simply had a higher household growth number in the past, and so they were basing their old methodology on this prior household growth. With the new methodology, they basically said, well, this doesn't make sense. We can't just build housing where the land is available. We need to build housing where the housing need is. And so hence the revised methodology that took into account things like jobs, access to transit, and that's all kind of in line with the state's greenhouse gas reduction targets too. You know, they realized that by putting the housing where the jobs and the transit is, that will help us achieve our greenhouse gas reduction targets. So that's why our number this cycle is a lot larger, because we do have a fair number of jobs in the city. We have over almost 100,000 jobs in the city, at least pre-COVID. We also have access to Expo, and so that has made Santa Monica a highly attractive place to develop housing. And so that's where our RHNA number is at right now, is at 8,800, because it's reflective of all this new methodology and these factors.
Great. And Rachel, one more for you. As the environmental planner that will be heading up the environmental impact report for this project, could you go a little bit into that timeline and kind of what areas it'll look like, what it'll discuss, so
Sure.
to prove that we have the capacity to actually build these units in the city?
Sure.
Infrastructure.
So as Jing mentioned, the notice of preparation was issued, and so I encourage you, if you have any comments on what should be studied in the environmental impact report, to submit your comments and your ideas to me. The process for the environmental impact report is that we'll go through the notice of preparation, we'll gather all the public input. But what the key topics that we know that we will be studying for the environmental impact report will be, of course, impacts on utilities, water supply, water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, public services, fire, police, parks. All of those will be addressed, and we'll be coordinating with our colleagues in these various departments to assess the impacts of 8,800 units, because as we all know, this does exceed our loose numbers, and so because it exceeds the loose numbers, we'll be doing this EIR to assess the impacts of this additional growth on the city. So the EIR process will take approximately, it's going to be an expedited EIR. It will take approximately 6 months, and we anticipate that the final EIR will be ready for adoption. Well, it has to be ready for adoption concurrent with the certification of the housing element.
Great. And it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. A handful of people want to make sure that they can get involved with helping shape the future goals of the housing element, or get involved in general with the housing element update. So Steve or Carrie, can you kind of just reiterate one more time how individuals can help shape the future goals and kind of get involved through this process moving forward?
Sure, thanks, Ross. So as Carrie had mentioned at the tail end of that section, we are encouraging participants to take that survey in terms of taking a look at our current goals and objectives that we have in the current element, and really start to share your ideas of whether or not those are appropriate and what you think about those. And then also Carrie can kind of go into some of the other outreach methods that we're planning.
Yeah, so you can check out our website that has information about joining the technical working groups, the questionnaire. You can contact us directly at housingupdate@smgov.net. We also really encourage you to sign up for project updates. I think that's the best way to hear about anything that's upcoming on the housing element update, ways for you to get involved, any study sessions going to Planning Commission or City Council. And definitely just keep checking back to the project website. We'll update that. The Get Involved tab will have everything that's coming up and any opportunity for you to participate in this process.
Great. And with sorry, keep going.
Just to add on to that, sorry to interrupt. So if you know of anybody who doesn't have access to technology or is unable to access these webinars, please let us know and forward their information. We'll be happy to help them out, as well as if you know anybody who need translation services as well, we'd be happy to do that and provide that so that we can ensure that all members of the community have access to this information. And presentation will be posted online as well. So.
Yeah, that is what I was going to end with. That I know there's a lot more questions that we didn't have time for, as we now have a couple more seconds. But all the questions will be posted on our website for the housing element update, as well as this presentation. And that concludes the first webinar, unless Jing, you have any closing remarks you want to make.
No, again, thank you everybody for taking the time over your lunch hour to join us. And we look forward to working with you on this update. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.